oh my God, this is not, okay, yes, it's marketing, I get it, but these are people's lives.
This category is so much more easier to sell.
But I really thought like the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry would be held to a higher standard because, these are people's bodies. It's not like you're selling, BMW versus Mercedes. Like most people would probably not choose to go into drug safety. It's why I like to call myself an accidental advocate because sometimes our greatest purposes choose us. I would never have chosen this work. However, on August 6th, I got a call from my dad to tell me that my husband was found dead, hanging at age 37. And never once at that time did we even think about the drug. Why would we? It was given to him by his doctor. It was FDA approved. And it was sold and advertised everywhere on TV as safe and effective. And I'm like, wait, there's no warnings on this? Like they've known about it? Well, it's part of the business plan. Like somebody like Woody is literally acceptable collateral damage. They know they can make a lot of money.
And having worked in India, China, and US in the pharma space, I have seen this happen firsthand, how narratives can be crafted and how, marketing happens and how sales can be boosted.
And talking about the brilliance of a market expansion strategy, how they were able to create a new disease called social anxiety disorder.
And in the last few years, I see the same marketing playbook being played out in India. Talking about brand extension and talking about market expansion. Think of Prozac for dogs, SSRIs for pets. Like what are we doing to those poor animals that we need to put them on antidepressants? What a market expansion. Zantac causing cancer, Zoloft and suicide, opioids. It's like a new scandal, say, every 4 or 5 years. And the truth comes out only after millions have been exposed.
And I always say, if you want to get to the bottom, ask the lawyer, not the FDA. I always say, go see if there's any lawsuits. Remember, this is all coming from Wall Street, not from patient safety stuff. And it said Alzheimer and the obesity drugs. Tell the companies to put monies aside for potential lawsuits. And they were telling the GLP-1s to be setting aside like huge amounts of money every quarter from their profits for the future lawsuits that they know were coming.
Namaskar, welcome to the Anulal Show. Today we'll be talking to Kim Witczak, who's a drug safety advocate. She sits on the FDA Drug Advisory Committee as a consumer representative. That is our representative. She has a visible view how drugs get approved and how they come to the market. Kim, I'm giving a very short bio, I know, because I want to have you talk about how you got started, your journey into drug safety, which started with a tragedy, and how you pulled off this fight. So welcome to the show, and can we have you talk about yourself first?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I love having these conversations. So yes, most people would probably not choose to go into drug safety. I like to call myself an accidental advocate because sometimes our greatest purposes choose us. I would never have chosen this work. But on August 6, 2003, so 22 years ago, I was happily married to my husband of almost 10 years, Woody, and life was good. We both had successful careers. We were just talking about starting a family, and Woody had just started his dream job with a startup company. I was traveling all over the world in advertising and marketing as a producer for BMW. So life was good. However, on August 6th, I got a call that literally rocked my world and changed the trajectory of my life. And I got a call from my dad to tell me that my husband was found dead, hanging at age 37. Woody had no history of depression. He had just started his dream job with a startup company earlier in 2003 and was having trouble sleeping, which is not uncommon for entrepreneurs. Anybody who knows that you wake up at 3 a.m. But he was a guy that always needed 8 hours of sleep. And he did what he's always done because he was a big athlete. He went to his doctor that he trusted. He's seen him for a lot of things, stitched up when he got bit in his head from playing sports, when you had knee surgery. And so he went to the doctor and was given a 3-week sample pack of Zoloft, which is an antidepressant, and said it would take the edge off and help him sleep. Well, that first 3 weeks when he was on the drug, I was actually down in New Zealand on a big BMW shoot. So I wasn't even home when Woody got put on this medication. When I got back, I'll never forget something that still haunts me to this day, but it was also something that turned out to be a pretty significant finding. I was waiting for Woody. Woody came walking back through our back door, completely drenched through his blue dress shirt. And he dropped his bag on the back door and fell into a fetal position. And he was crying and he kept going, "Kim, you got to help me. I don't know what's happening to me. My head's outside my body looking in." And he's like bawling. And I remember like I had never, we had been together 3 years before we got married. Like I said, almost 10 years of marriage. We calmed him down. We prayed. We did yoga breathing. And he called his doctor and his doctor said, "You got to give it 4 to 6 weeks for the drug to kick in." And every night the next week, Woody would come home and he'd be like, "What do you think about acupuncture? I'm going to beat this feeling in my head. What do you think about hypnosis? What do you think about?" I mean, he was trying everything, and never once at that time did we even think about the drug. Why would we? It was given to him by his doctor. It was FDA approved, and it was sold and advertised everywhere on TV as safe and effective. And so obviously you can imagine that when I hadn't heard from my husband all day and I'm like, "Hey, Dad, do me a favor." I'm like thinking he hit his head because he was having trouble sleeping. And for my dad to go over there and find what he had to see with his own eyes, and then to have to call me because I was out of town, it was my busy time, and to tell me that Woody was dead. And literally in that moment, my entire world blew up. It blew up. Everything intuitively in my body, everything in my body was saying, there's no way, Woody wouldn't kill it. I mean, I couldn't even wrap my head around, killed himself. We just booked our 10-year anniversary trip to Thailand. We had to go through in vitro in order for it to have kids. We had all these plans and I was like, that made no sense. But literally, that night when Woody was found and, I'm in Detroit trying to figure out how to get home, the coroner called because, obviously at this time my dad called the cops and the coroner came to our house and the coroner asked me one question. She asked me, "Was Woody taking any medication?" That was clue number one. The only thing he was taking was Zoloft. And I said, "I think it was Zoloft." I didn't even really know what it was. And she goes, "We're going to take it with us. It might have something to do with his death." So that was clue number one. Clue number two, the exact same day that Woody was found was the front page of our newspaper in Minneapolis that had an article that said the UK finds link between antidepressants and suicide in teens. The same day that Woody died. I will always say, because Woody and I both traveled all the time for work, he always left notes. And I remember, you didn't leave a note for the biggest trip of your life. There were no notes. He never left a note. But in some ways, I feel like those two things that night that happened the same day were his note. The clue that got us on this path that is what I do today, 22 years later, doing drug safety work.
That's some strength must have pulled you through towards this fight, because otherwise normally a person would not really go down this path, and you really turned it into a work which must have benefited so many people after that, because I think Zoloft did not have a black box warning at that time, but now it does.
My brother-in-law was at the house that night and he went home and Googled Zoloft and suicide and had no idea that the FDA had hearings in 1991 when it was just Prozac on the market. And it was the emergence of violence and suicide with Prozac. So that was our first like entree in. I'm like, wait, there's no warnings on this? Like they've known about it? Well, fast forward, the FDA, almost every member on that committee at that time, the advisory board that I had 3 terms on, took money from pharmaceutical companies making antidepressants. And so they all said, nope, we don't see anything. And meanwhile, the FDA never followed up with Eli Lilly and now approved Zoloft and Paxil for kids. And so that really became like our warning of, and what he used to always say, Kim, I'll never judge my life based on how much money I make, or my career will be based on my family, my friends, and leaving the world a better place. And I remember like, oh my God, we have to do something because this is not going to be the legacy that Woody is going to leave. So it kind of was the combination of that. But I will say, when you talk about strength, I still wonder how I had that. But I remember when Eric, my brother-in-law, went and started discovering all of this, and he wrote to David Healy, and David Healy wrote back and immediately wrote back. And Eric, meanwhile, is gathering all this information. And I'm like thinking, what just happened in my life? And I'll never forget, after a funeral, I was sitting down in the basement. And for anybody who's gone through grief, like heartache's real. And I was trying to literally like scratch it out of my heart. Like I wanted my heart to go, like the pain to go away. And I just kept praying over and over, God, take my pain and use it. It does me no good. I had no idea what that prayer meant. I was just like, oh my God, just take this. Like it hurts so bad. And my brother-in-law was meanwhile praying, like, what do I do with all this information? He came to me and he goes, I think I figured out what happened to Woody. And then it became like, game on, let's go. And so we literally started. I realized, because I'm in the process of writing my book and I'm going back to the time when Woody died, I still have a hard time, like that pain is still like as raw as it was then. And I realized that there's a part of me that wanted to just take action so that I didn't have to sit in that pain. And so my action actually did do good in that it became our mission to get black box warnings put on. But I was shocked that I'm like, wait, you guys knew about it in 91? Didn't you? Yeah, it's a pretty crazy story. And to think that there were no warnings. But it's also why I keep saying that you having these kind of shows and keeping this conversation alive and the importance of it is really, really, really important, because I think back, I was in college in 1991, right? Or I just got graduated from college.
Who thinks of these things?
I wasn't paying attention to what was on the news. I never knew that the FDA had hearings. And the same thing, like today, I hear about parents who were like probably in college or maybe kids when the 2004, 2006 hearings were going on, where I was in the middle of them, right? And parents today, people today have no idea what was going on in 2004, 2006. And I think the mental health crisis is growing. So I think it's really important to have these conversations. So thank you.
Thanks. Also being marketed, I get my perspective from being industry insider to an extent. And having worked in India, China, and US in the pharma space, I have seen this happen in the US firsthand, how narratives can be crafted, how marketing happens, how sales can be boosted. And this was about 25 years ago, and I kind of left it there. But in the last few years, I see the same marketing playbook being played out in India. And, when you've done it yourself, when you've seen it happen, you recognize it. So the moment I've started seeing it in India, I've started recognizing the playbook. And when we started this call, we were talking about this book by Ethan Waters, Crazy Like Us. So he talks of how the mental health crisis, whether it is antidepressants or whether it is PTSD, has been marketed like it is in the US, in Japan, in Sri Lanka, in Hong Kong, in different countries. And that's what makes you think that this is a playbook and this is not something which just happens just like that. And I'm sure that, you would believe that if the system, doctors and regulators were vigilant, they could have prevented this tragedy, right? And a lot of other tragedies too.
Right. Well, and I think it's interesting. I love talking to marketing people. So my background's marketing and advertising. So I literally, in addition to the personal experience, I've spent my entire career in advertising and marketing, not on pharmaceuticals, but I understand the game of I've worked on big brands, and I know the games that we play. I know the games, like how you create narratives. I know how where you want to create the experts and where you want to create a desire, and then you have the need, and then you sell hope, and then you sell fear, and then it's like part of this whole like mixture of things. But it's really interesting when I think about the pharmaceuticals is truthfully, I really thought it was different until I learned in like I thought it was just isolated with antidepressants. But I really thought like the pharmaceutical industry would be and the medical industry would be held to a higher standard because, these are people's bodies. It's not like you're selling a BMW versus Mercedes, like that's not going to kill you. But these are products you put in your bodies and like they could kill you. But once I got into this work, and one of the things I had was I had a big failure to warn wrongful death lawsuit against Pfizer and got all these internal documents out from under seal. And one of the things that I found really fascinating from my lawyers and what they said is one of the first places they go is to the marketing department. And I was like, the marketing department? Why would they go to the marketing department? Then I started learning about this. And then I was like, wait, this is like it's the trapping of the system, but it's the whole system and how it works, right? And I always, to this day now, it drives my patient and drug safety advocates a little crazy because I like to say, you guys, we're not patients, we're customers. And once you see through that lens, like why wouldn't you want a customer for life? Like you want a customer from cradle to grave. If I was like, it's evilly brilliant, if I would say it. Like, you were just talking about the marketing. One of my advertising, he was one of the partners at the agency I was working at the time. And he went out to do a mini MBA at Harvard Business School. And he brought back this article, and I still have it, and talking about the brilliance of a market expansion strategy. And it was using Paxil in how they were able to create a new disease called social anxiety disorder. And it was studied in the business school and it was held up as an example of brilliant product marketing expansion strategy. And I thought he brought it home and I'm like, oh my God, this is not okay. Yes, it's a marketing. I get it. Like, but these are people's lives. Like these are people's lives.
Talking about brand extension and talking about market expansion, think of Prozac for dogs, SSRIs for pets. Like what are we doing to those poor animals that we need to put them on SSRI drugs, antidepressants? What food are we feeding them? What a market expansion. And that is a very fast growing category. It's a hugely fast growing category of drugs. And it's kind of like, you want to step back and ask yourself, is my education for this?
Yeah. Exactly.
I don't want to be in this space.
Exactly. That's so fascinating. You're right, though. I remember when I would hear, because they were starting to market and it's interesting because you're in India, I'm in the US. And so, we talk about mental health all the time. Everybody, like, it's almost to the point where, and there was intentional campaigns that were funded by pharmaceutical companies to say, make it okay. And it was, the National Alliance for Mentally Ill, like putting all this funding into like, let's destigmatize mental health. But I think it's gone so overboard that like kids and now everybody talks about mental health. I'm depressed or I have anxiety or like even my dog is anxious because we've got the fireworks coming up and my dog will freak out. And I'm like, what? We've become like just completely numb. So it's interesting to hear that you're starting to see it in India, but maybe that's a brand new country that hasn't been marketed to because there's probably been other ways that have been probably more in the naturopathic, or I like to think naturopathic or whatnot, that, you're now a new ripe territory.
I love this conversation, how freely this is flowing between two marketeers. So I had a set of friends who were working in the statins division at a point of time. So, you had to get posters made, talk to doctors, the cholesterol levels and how to market, how to get people to go to a doctor's chamber And then, of course, the doctors would take over with the prescription drugs. And then the mental health category started expanding in India. One sought a transfer within the company, and the other was transferred outside. And they were absolutely thrilled because you know what? No blood test required. This is brilliant because
Brilliant.
you can just diagnose with the questionnaires, and the questionnaires can be put online. The questionnaires can be put inside a magazine, and you can just ask people, do you think you are sad? We all know how prescription pads can be bought. So sales are so much more easier. This category is so much more easier to sell.
Yeah, it's completely ripe because there's no blood test, right? And it's kind of self-diagnosing. And then if you look at the screening form, the PHQ-9, which the Pfizer marketing people that helped to create it. Well, I call it a sales. So I saw this one well before. There's a brand, it's called Land's End. It's a catalog for retail, it's like clothing, etc. here in the States. And we were the first ad agency that they've ever hired outside of, they've never had to have one, but they call it the funnel. And they said, we know that once a customer and we've had the same customer base, once they're in our catalog, they're ours. But we need to expand our, potential. And so we need you to go out and create a desire to think of Land's End as fashion. So we did like a fashion shoot, and so that we could bring all these new people up here to put us into the funnel, into the consideration. And then once they got in the catalog, the company took over because they knew how to like market to the company, into the catalog. And I was like, wait, this is exactly what they're doing with the pharma, with these screenings. And then you had mentioned with the statins. And I think they learned from, like, when I think about the statins, when you change guidelines, right? Like, so you think about who's establishing the guidelines. So here's another principle of the marketing. Well, if your threshold used to be here, now who's the people determining it? They're like, the companies figure that out. We're going to get to them. If we lower it, now look at the difference. This is all new marketing. It's more sales. Like,
new fish in the net.
Yeah, like it's so obvious to me. And then when you start but then again, being kind of naive, it's fun talking to a marketer, like you said, because you were inside, I was always outside, but then I've gotten thrown into this work. And I look at, again, I always thought pharmaceuticals were at a higher standard, but they're not. And once I saw in some of the documents that came out from the lawsuit, there was this idea that Pfizer already knew. It was the concept of ghostwriting, but Pfizer already knew what articles, the journal articles, when they were running, what the subject was on, but it said author TBD. So they already knew where the articles were going to run that are going to speak to the doctors who have to prescribe the drug. They didn't know who was going to write the art, who it was officially going to be from. So it said author TBD. And I'm like, wait, so you're like to me, it just seems like one big kind of marketing, sales driven. And at the end of the day, the unfortunate thing that I had to learn is people like Woody, and I've met countless, and what do they say? 2 or 3 leading cause is properly prescribed medications in the US. And so I feel like we're just the cost of doing business. And, it's the profits over people. And at the end of the day, I think the hardest thing for us to remember, and I say us, meaning just the layperson like myself, is that if you think about companies, and it's not saying that they are all evil, I don't mean this at all, but who are they really beholden to? It's their shareholders, right? And it's not really even though you think you're doing it, and I think people inside the companies think they're doing good jobs too, just like the FDA. But I've come, sitting on the FDA, I've now started to see the FDA and and how the companies view it. It's a hurdle you have to go over to get it on the market. And once you get it on the market, you can advertise it in our country because we have, we're one of only 2 countries that allow drug ads. So Anyways, it's
The
very,
thing with FDA is that FDA is considered a gold standard pretty much across the world. So if a drug or a procedure or a device gets approved by FDA, it already has that opinion leader build up in the rest of the markets. I mean, I don't even call them countries. I think I'm so hardwired to call them markets. This is, one thing I've wanted to ask somebody from who has an insider perspective, that when you have seen FDA from the inside, do you think that the regulator itself is captured? And if it is captured, is it like the watchdog is in bed with the industry that they're supposed to protect us from? And should we even be expecting that kind of protection coming from the FDA?
yeah. I mean, I have to say, I used to think, I go back and say, when your whole world blows up, everything that you thought you believed, you actually have to like rethink and go, why do I believe this? Right. And I think with the FDA, I think we have been educated to, and then for sure doctors as well, like it's FDA approved. So it went through rigorous standards. It's been told and sold to us as it's the gold standard, as you said. And it's usually, if the FDA approves it, it'll probably get approved in other, markets by their regulators. And everybody believes that it's the highest standard. Well, it's interesting because in the US, we, and I think it was like in the 90s, we have something called the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, PDUFA, which it was kind of during the AIDS crisis. It was born out of that, where there was so much pressure of not approving drugs fast enough. So, and the budgets were low, et cetera. So Congress created something, the prescription drug. So basically the industry pays for, a fee for every application to get attention from the FDA to approve their drugs faster or on a timeline, etc. And so that is one place where I think it's captured, meaning the industry pays millions of dollars to have their drugs reviewed by the company. And so they kind of feel like, you know what? We're a customer of the FDA, right? We're paying a lot of money. And so we have expectations that we want you to deliver us on our, help us figure out how we're going to get this on the market. So that's one thing. And then I think there's been a lot of fast tracking mechanisms that Congress put in, like breakthrough therapy, all these designations to allow the companies, like if you look now in the US, a lot of drugs are coming on the market for unmet needs, meaning there is no drug on the market for that need or has been approved. So it's maybe being used off label, because that's really, once it's on the market, a doctor can use it way because the FDA doesn't regulate doctors. But the unmet need, and a lot of the drugs, especially in the psych, and most of mine that I'm going to talk about are from the mental health, the psychiatric area. But a lot of our drug reviews that we're reviewing on the FDA have used some kind of fast tracking mechanism. So like a Parkinson's psychosis drug. And when you come, which it had only like 180 people in it, one trial. It's less trials. So this idea of gold standard, which I think a lot of people think means that you have to replicate the trial, right? But with some of these breakthrough, it might be a really small trial and you have one. And then you start going, wait, how many people have dropped out? How can you really see safety? When does safety show up? And so for sure, this Parkinson's psychosis, and I love telling this story because it reminds me of my marketing. So when we took on new clients at the agency, we had to literally understand an entire, like what the industry was, who's their competition, the good, the bad, the ugly. We had to do a 360 review, etc. And so I remember, so my brain just naturally thinks like that. On the FDA committee, most people are, they work for academia or they might be scientists. So they're coming from a very specific for that designed trial. But as a consumer rep, I come from a different background, right? So I remember doing that review of like, I wonder what Wall Street has to say about this drug that we were looking at. So I listened to Wall Street. I listened to the CEO analyst call. And so I was super fascinated by that because this company had already tried to use the gold standard. It was the gold standard of 2 trials prior to this approval, all right? But it failed. And so now they were able to go back and use unmet need, and they were able to, instead of the 18 point or whatever number of point of scale, they were able to reduce it down to 9. It was for Parkinson's. So I'm like, well, of course you're going to pick the 9, the best scale that you're going to look good in. It was a make or break for the company. If they didn't get approval, they would be out of business. So I'm like, oh, this means everything's poured into this trial, right?
And just 130 people on trial. How many people did you say?
Yep, 184, this Parkinson's drug. And so that means half is on placebo, right? More importantly, I started reading all the comments because I always learned a long time ago that comments are where the truth lives sometimes, or what the real, right? And I saw all these like comments between analysts, Wall Street people saying, well, this drug has the potential to be a $2 to $3 billion year drug, and I off label. So I'm like, oh, I think I just figured out their game plan. Get it approved on this small indication for an unmet need. It's going to be ultimately used off label where there's a much bigger potential for drug, sale. And so anyways, so that was like one of my like light bulbs. And so I get to, when sitting on the panel, I get to ask those questions of the company. Like, how can I be assured that you're not going to market this or that it won't be used off label? So I can ask those kind of questions. But most of my other committee members are like looking at me like I'm what is she talking about? Like, why is she talking about marketing? Like, why is she once it's on, we're going to be talking about like the design of the clinical trial, like the, statistically significant p-value. And I'm like, that doesn't matter to the real person, to the doctor. Like, yeah, of course it does. But like the average person's going to see it and it's going to be promoted as, and sure enough, this drug was promoted as breakthrough by the FDA too, but it was really breakthrough in the designation that it was using for regulatory pathway. The company said breakthrough. So then it gets picked up by the media and it's picked up as a breakthrough, spun, and it was picked up as a breakthrough for the Parkinson's patients. And so then it became like the Parkinson's patient advocacy groups that are funded by pharmaceutical companies now are promoting it. And it became like cycle. And I remember saying, because at the FDA, when we're sitting there, I always tell everybody, don't just listen to what an advisory board vote is, because it might say 13-2 or whatever. And I said, you should actually listen to everybody's explanation afterwards of why they voted a certain way, right? Because almost everyone will still bring up potential safety issues, but they're like, oh, but we got options for people, right? We need more tools in the tool chest. When you look at where a lot of them come from when they work for academia, you never know, like, because pharma funds so much monies to academic institutions, like, but anyways, the only 2 people on this drug that voted no were myself and the Parkinson's patient, somebody who she was the patient rep, so she lived with the disease. Her and I were the only 2 that voted no. And I remember saying in my explanation, I said, mark my words, this is going to become a trial lawyer's dream years from now, because I saw some safety things in there. Sure enough, a couple of years later, CNN comes back and calls me and said, hey, apparently there had been a lot of deaths that were attributed to this new drug. And they were coming and wanted to know why I voted no. And that was 2 years afterwards. And I explained what I just did with you. And I was like, and all these people and patients, the everyday person like me who would see something being advertised and it's like a breakthrough, and I want to give it to my parent or my loved one because, they're suffering. Like, it works. It works as it's designed to work. And that's to sell products.
The worst part is that this is not a one-off case. There's a pattern to this deception. And we've seen this play out again and again, whether we're talking of antidepressants, Vioxx, Zantac causing cancer, Zoloft and suicide, opioids. It's like a new scandal, say, every 4 or 5 years. And the truth comes out only after millions have been exposed to that particular drug or that particular device. And it always seems to me when I'm reading these cases that the companies always seem to know of the risks, but they never tell. They never tell. So in every case, the investigation starts like the company knew about it, but they failed to communicate, and that's where the lawsuit starts. And I'm seeing this pattern now with the obesity drugs. As now lawyers have started soliciting cases, and people are putting in their data. They're saying, "Oh, we were not told this." And just 2 years ago, FDA updated the black box warning on Ozempic and other weight loss drugs after patient experiences. So why is it that the FDA seems 10 steps behind what even patients seem to know?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that pattern, so you think about it, a lot of drugs come on market, they do not have the warnings, right? Some might, like, if like some of the new antipsychotics or any new antidepressants now, because we already know the antidepressants have issues, they might come on the market with a black box warning. But initially with new drugs, like the Ozempics, they come on the market, but it's not until they start. And if you also look at the post-marketing systems, which is really supposed to be where the flagging happens. But most people, like, if the doctors don't know to report, the patients don't know to report, you're not really getting the full picture, but you're still getting people who are reporting, right? So there were enough people that have come forward with harms, or there's lawsuits because all of a sudden and I always say, if you want to get to the bottom, ask the lawyer, not the FDA. Go see if there's any lawsuits. Lawsuits, what I learned, I used to think they were frivolous until I had one, and I was like, oh, this is why they do everything they can to keep you from even remotely doing lawsuits, right? But like with the Ozempic, I could have, again, I went back a couple of years ago, and every January in the US, there's it's the big healthcare, JP Morgan's healthcare conference. It's Wall Street, and it's like what the new products are going to be, what the new potential. And this was like a couple of years ago, and the two were the two areas of focus which had the biggest opportunity for market growth. Remember, this is all coming from Wall Street, not from patient safety stuff. And it said Alzheimer and the obesity drugs. And I was like, wait, everything that we're going to start seeing is going to be focusing on these two, kind of whether it's associated or not. And so I feel like it's a business. I happen to be completely separate. I was fishing with somebody who works in reinsurance, which is the insurance agents that kind of tell the companies to put monies aside for potential lawsuits. And they were telling the GLP-1s to be setting aside like huge amounts of money every quarter from their profits for the future lawsuits that they know were coming. And so I think it's like a backwards strategy, but it's kind of built. I mean, the reality is, and I lived it, so I can say it, I feel like it's part of the business plan. Like somebody like Woody is literally acceptable collateral damage. They know they can make a lot of money. There's going to be people who are hurt. And so I think like even when I look at when COVID vaccines came out, and I know I don't know if we were going to go there, but when I just saw the words marketed safe and effective for everyone, a one size fits all, I'm like, wait a minute, that's not even true, because everybody knows our bodies are different. Like my body, like clearly Woody's body couldn't handle antidepressants. Somebody else might, I mean, we don't know what bodies are like. And so these harms, but I think, the FDA tends to react. They're not proactive. And that's what I think we all have to remember as a layperson. And then there's always the idea of companies like Pfizer trying to remove a black box warning. And they got, I don't know what you guys call it in India, but in the US it was Chantix, which is like, it's a smoking cessation drug. They might call it Champex in other countries. And I always say the other thing that I think drug companies are really good at and the FDA is they use the chemical names of drugs, and not like the consumer doesn't really, even if it's no longer generic, it's no longer a brand name, but it's people still, like consumers don't if you say, I think it's called Varsaline or something, whatever, I can never say these chemical names, but it's Chantix. Now, if you say Chantix, consumers know immediately what kind of drug it is. But when you use a chemical name, they have no idea what the drug is, right? And I think that's by design too. And so this Chantix, it came onto the market with no black box warning. But eventually there were over 2,800 lawsuits for neuropsychiatric, so violence, hallucinations, suicides. And Pfizer settled the lawsuits for almost $300 million. And as part of the settlement, they silenced every one of the people who had lawsuits. So people who had, like, there were activists, as like somebody who would have been like me, it would have been silenced. So I would have to take down, like, I know people who had to take down their websites. They could never show up at an FDA or tell their story in public because as part of the settlement, they were silenced. After all of that was taken,
Like putting money in people's mouths, just literally shutting people off.
Yeah, literally shutting them off. And so after all of that was done, Pfizer went back to the FDA and said they wanted to take the class-wide black box warning off the drug. And they said they did a new study in Europe called the Eagles study that showed that there weren't any issues with the violence and suicide. So I was literally like super excited because now I'm on the FDA panel and I was going to ask, are we going to hear from the victims? Because I knew they weren't, because I work with lawyers and I also know I know a couple people that did all the advocacy kind of work that I do. And I was going to ask, like, are we going to hear from the people? Because if we're going to remove the warning, we need to know about why it was put on. Well, a couple days before that meeting, I got a call from the FDA that it had come to their attention that I had an intellectual bias. And I didn't even know what that meant. I'm like, and I couldn't be on the committee. And so I still showed up on my own dime because I wanted my committee members to hear about the fact that there were lawsuits. The victims weren't going to be there because they didn't even have an opportunity to be there during the open public hearing to actually see what happened to them. And so the lawsuit never really got brought up on record during the decision. And ultimately, the FDA, with the advisory committee blessing, removed this warning. And today, that warning is gone. And that was a warning, the black box, that didn't exist, but it was the lawsuits. And so that's coming full circle back to your...
That is so sad at so many multiple levels. And an intellectual bias towards safety is something that we should all have. I mean, why should it only be one person's job? But then, I was reading somewhere that 33% of medicines have safety warnings updates after FDA approves them, either by way of black box warnings or by way of the drug is withdrawn or something else. So 33% of medicines that are approved post an FDA approval run into problems. That's a huge number. That's a huge number. And clearly it seems like it's not a broken system, but a deliberate business model, which is like, as you said, it's acceptable collateral damage that, you sell first and then you can pay the $1 billion later.
Yeah. I mean, again, the hard part, or not the hard part, but it's easy for me to see, is I understand company, I'm in business and I still am in marketing. Like, I understand the idea of making money and profits and that's what you're doing. But with this, it's just different. Like, it's got to be held to a higher standard because these are lives. And so, I understand that you can kind of game the system or hey, we're going to make hay while this, what is it? Hey, make hay while the sun shines and we'll deal with the damaged hay later, I mean, and so I feel like with the Ozempics, and we're seeing now, when millions of people start taking a product, and remember, these drugs are they come to market with not as many people as potentially can be taking them. Or you look at the ones that have issues, they tend to be and I call them lifestyle drugs, but you know what I mean? Like the Vioxxes, the GLP, the Ozempics, the depression pills, it's these things that are so easily able to be marketed to get into our mindset. And I think Americans especially, but I think it's also humans too. But we want the quick fix, right? We want, like, we're kind of designed to like do the easy thing, not the hard, right? Right. So like, you're like, wait, I can take a pill and I'm not going to be, I'm not going to be sad, or I can take an injection. And yes, it helps some people. And I think that's where it always gets a little mixed, is because it can help some people. So then it becomes like it helps everybody. And, I think back to after Woody died, and I was at the doctor, and the doctor said, "Do you think you need something?" And I looked at her and I was like, well, I think the drug is what killed him. But more importantly, aren't I supposed to hurt? Like, my husband died. Aren't I supposed to
You're
hurt?
grieving. Grief is a normal thing.
Yeah. And she said, no, but you don't need to. And I was like, nobody promised the world to be without suffering, right? That's kind of a spiritual kind of like, belief. And so this idea that we think we can medicalize every single part of being human is just like, I think we need to almost take a step back, go upriver, and zoom out and go, what are we doing? And maybe it's not going to be in the system that'll do that because it's a business, but maybe it's like you and I, everyday people, that have to like look at it. Because remember, companies are made up of, just like the FDA is made up with everyday people too. And that's where an opportunity exists.
You're basically talking about normalizing sadness and normalizing grief. And that takes me back to, I think, Alan Francis' book, which is about saving normal rather than medicalizing every human emotion. And then a lot of doctors, the whole industry believes in medicalizing emotions because there's money to be made of it. And that's how it's flourished. So our opinions, in fact, you and I are not even supposed to have opinions because we're not trained as doctors. But increasingly, a lot of psychologists and a lot of doctors are coming around to this fact that maybe we don't need to medicalize emotions as much.
Yeah. And, or maybe, I have been in this process for 22 years, and I feel like I'm just in the last couple of years, like my own personal healing and coming through.
Tell us more about your process of healing. How did that happen?
One of the first things that with my own healing was I threw myself into this advocacy, right? I was on a plane almost every other week out to DC. It helped me numb the pain because I was able. So that eventually became part of it. But I remember like just this idea of talking and having to relearn a lot of things. Like I had to relearn, and even like physically moving my body, like getting out. Like I didn't even know how to walk. I mean, like go running. I had to go walk, and it was like one step at a time. I did a lot of body work that I believe that trauma gets stuck in our bodies. And it was really something, it was Rolfing. So I'm big natural on some of that functional medicine, but it was something called Rolfing, which I'd never heard of.
I know Rolfing, yeah.
So you know Rolfing. So it was
very popular in our yoga circles.
Oh, see, that's why I was going to say, that's why I think there's a lot to be learned from how, in other countries heal first versus, going the American way. But when I did Rolfing, it was the first, the pulling your fascia, and we got into my diaphragm area, and I think it's session 6, and she's, like yanking it. And that's where I think like that grief, like stopped breathing, right? And the breath work, it stopped. And when I got into the Rolfing, she got into session 6, I ended up crying, like bawling my eyes out for like 2 hours. Like it wouldn't stop. She let me just cry. And I was like, wait, that's all inside me. And so it just got me thinking about, part of sometimes it's like feeling it and still taking a step forward. And it's okay if you don't feel great. It's surrounding yourself in community and people. And so I feel like it's taken a long time. I would not trade it in a million years. I think sometimes we forget that our growth comes from pain. And it's like, it's forged in the fire is our soul growth. And it's just, I don't know that you could ever medicalize it. And if you do decide to go down the medicine route, I do think it's really important that people have the full story of the informed consent. Like, this isn't meant to be a daily vitamin for 20 years and then realizing people can't get off of it. And, I think these are all part of the conversation that needs to be part of.
And it's not even tested for 20 years. Most of the trials, especially for psychiatric medicines, I think have not gone beyond a few weeks, and maybe
Yeah.
one or two gone beyond maybe up to a year, but there were nobody's really seen long-term effects. So if somebody's been
Right.
put on 20 years, it's only the patient data that's going to tell the marketers and the people that how does it work. And here, circling back to patient advocacy groups, they don't help because they were supposed to pick up data from the ground and take them back to the doctors. But the fact that patient advocacy groups are funded by the pharma companies, it negates the whole purpose.
Well, or it's actually designed exactly the way it was supposed to. Like, because I look at it and go, wait, they're doing your marketing for you. They're like no different than your influencers, right? Your social media influencers. You get in there. Yes, you're right. In theory, and it's what I say about everything. In theory, a lot of things start out in good, right? Like with the good intention. But, like the idea, like you just said, they were supposed to be on the ground, like gathering data to help us be better, like, stewards of our patients, right? I can hear this marketing talk being good. But what happens, and if you go to, I always say follow the money. And it was like such a brilliant thing that my late husband always told me, Kim, if you want to get to the bottom of anything, follow the money.
Follow the money. Absolutely.
And so that is like what we did. And so when I learned, like, wait, like I've started nonprofits. I know how hard it is to run nonprofits without money. And if there's like a corporate sponsor that's going to give you money, even though you say it's church and state, the reality is they're funders. And so then when Pharma calls you up and says, hey, we're having a drug advisory committee meeting. We would love to have some patients that could come and speak on behalf of whatever X, Y, and Z. Well, all of a sudden, boom, there they are. And if you go to a lot of these FDA advisory committee meetings, who are the ones that are there actually speaking? It is pharma funded patient advisory, or, the patient or the consumer groups that bring and they'll say, they always say the same thing. I'm here, my funding, my travel was paid for by the pharmaceutical company or the advisor, the advocacy group, but I have no personal gain with the outcome of this decision. I'm like, yeah, because you're being used.
They're being used. And earlier you were speaking of academia and ghostwritten articles. I think it is David Healy who first came up with the number that 30% of academic articles for drugs are written by ghostwriters. And then the TBD, they put the name much later. So if you aggregate all of this, the marketing spent versus the spent on R&D is way higher. Way higher.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think we've been trained like, oh no, we put, at least in the US, all the money goes to R&D. And I'm like, because you're so right. Like I kind of created now something and I called the spider web, because it was like the trapping of the doctor and the patient in there. Like I see it with like the academic institutions. And even if somebody, the funding goes through, they support it, they give grants. And I learned something just in the last year. I didn't realize in the US, if you're a full tenured professor, you're still responsible for getting some research grant money as part of your salary. So of course you're gonna you're not gonna be outspoken and kind of biting the hand that feeds you, right? So it kind of buys even silenced, quiet self-censoring, right? Because you don't want to like offset your, the whole system is really well designed it's a system that's captured.
It's a well-oiled machine, superlatively well-oiled machine that works. And we don't realize when we get caught there because, uh, as a marketer, I would say that we catch people when they're very vulnerable. When a person goes to buy a car, they're not vulnerable. They're buying out of pleasure, they may be buying out of need. But when one is shopping for medicines, one is definitely shopping out of grief or pain or vulnerability, which gets
Yeah.
exploited. And as you've been saying throughout, I wish there were more higher standards than what we have.
Yeah, I just, I think if that was a message I would say to pharma marketers, we should have higher standards. I mean, these are people's lives, and we shouldn't
Yeah.
like the ideas that I've had is imagine your clinical trials, right? When you do clinical trial design, that you actually put faces to every single person that's in your trial, right? Like, this is not patient number 25. It's a name, it's a person, it's somebody's love. Like, it's not just like a lab rat. And same with like marketing, like behind every person, knowing that there's going to be somebody that's like, even just thinking like, not that I think even I would suspect, because I've been on the inside of like other companies that are like, we're helping people. Imagine all the people that are going to be like, so I'm sure that the inside company speak is imagine all the people we're helping. Nobody on the inside is probably thinking, hey, we got to really be talking about those harmed people, because I, I mean, I'm curious from somebody like there's probably all this like employee engagement around like all the good that we're doing in the world, all the good. And you don't really want to talk about the ugly side of things. But I think we have to remember the ugly side too, because those are somebody's love and kids.
Absolutely. I mean, and you know what? There is legal fee budgeted to handle the acceptable collateral damage, and there is legal fee budgeted to come out of these cases. And this is more from a US standpoint. We don't have so many cases in India because we don't have branded drugs. We get the branded generics once drugs come off patent. And even then, when a drug has seen that cycle in the US, it's very, very hard to get that kind of compensation in India. It's very hard because we don't have those kind of laws. And in the country where those laws exist, it's always surprised me that people don't seem to be aware of them. Like when drug labels say black box warnings, why aren't people don't even read food labels, forget about reading drug labels.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah, it is scary. And I think you're so right. A lot of people, including I've heard doctors say, well, they have to put, that's lawyers that are making them. So
yeah.
oh, that's just a lawyer thing. Like, and so we just think, well, that's just a lawyer thing, or like, that's never, and I think there's this idea that we don't think anything's ever going to happen to us, right? Like, so if you're going skydiving and they're like, one out of like whatever million people will, and you're thinking there's no way I'll be the one in the million. So you just jump out the plane. And I think the same thing happens. No one ever thinks that they're going to be the one that is going to be that small percent or almost non-existent percent, or maybe it's bigger because we find out after the marketing starts. So it's just about being aware, and really there's warnings on these drugs because this is what's already known. But I always tell people, go and see, just Google if there's any lawsuits, because if there's lawsuits, especially in the US, and obviously when you talk about, you get branded generics, right? Well, I mean, that's a whole other thing in the US. Like, generics already are legally protected. They have immunity in the US. So you can't even, like, if something happens on a generic, you can't even sue a company. So, and then they also, it's not like you can easily go sue a company in the US, even though it's probably easier than in other countries. They'll do everything they can to keep you from ever being able to go do discovery and get lawsuits thrown out. So if there are lawsuits or you go and you investigate, it's really important to take that stuff serious. And also the generic, going back again, it's what I said way back my very first time at the FDA. Stop calling it sertraline and paroxetine. Call it Paxil and Zoloft, and because that's the brand that I can like understand, right, as a consumer. Well, this is just a story. I was at my friend's house down in Arizona, and her mom's in a nursing home. And the doctor called and said, hey, they were saying, we haven't gotten your approval to add this medication to your mom's list, right? So I'm like, I'm curious, what is your mom's list of medicines, right? Because she's in the nursing home. She shows me, and of course, I don't know what any of the names are until I Google them. And I'm like, why's your mom on 3 different antidepressants?
Oh my God.
And I goes, is your mom a schizophrenic? She goes, what? Because it's all the chemical names, generic names. And I'm like, so I didn't even know what they were until I went and Googled them. If I were you, I would ask the doctor, why is my mom on 3 antidepressants?
Kim, regarding old age homes, nursing homes, and schizophrenia, that's a connection that is so dark that a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking to somebody who's written a book on Johnson and Johnson, and he was telling me how doctors in nursing homes put patients on schizophrenia drugs because a lot of these drugs that they put people on have effects which are not being tested, right? So one drug is tested for one life cycle, and the 3 or 4 antidepressants, like you said, they're not being tested. So a lot of times outcomes could be something which is something we don't know. So it is safer for a doctor to say that the patient could be schizophrenic because then the outcome that is not good is easy to justify.
Yeah, blame the patient.
Oh yeah, of course, blame the patient. Because we don't know the drug interaction. Nobody's ever tested the drug interaction. It's not even possible at all.
That is so true. And you brought up another good point, which I think everybody needs to be aware of, is that the drugs are tested in the most ideal, perfect setting against if it should be a placebo, not what real world is, right? So real world would be like if you might be on a cocktail or you might be drinking too because you have PTSD. That's why the real world is so important because like this woman, so I actually said, I want to hear what the doctor says. So she called up the doctor and because I wanted to hear what he said about why her mother was on 3. Because I told her, I go, that's never been tested ever. He said that there's been some studies, and I don't know who these studies are, that show that microdosing a bunch of or smaller is better than one at a higher dose. And I'm like,
there have been studies? Really?
who knows? I mean, if maybe a university is doing it, but it's not really a pharma company study, right? But pharma company studies to get the drug on the market, which is the initial hurdle going over the FDA, is the best test study. You're going to control all the elements you can to get the best results so you can get it FDA approved.
You say the best study, you mean that that's the one that's going to have the most positive outcomes as compared to any other studies, obviously, because it's been funded by the company.
Yeah, so that's the other thing. The studies, those are funded by the pharmaceutical companies. They're not funded by, I used to think they're NIH might do things afterwards, but the drugs to get them on the market are pharma funded.
Mhm.
And so they're pharma funded. And, I think, again, using my marketing brain, when we're trying to sell a campaign into our client, we know how to make sure that we have the room full of staffed with the right potential customers, that we're going to get the outcome that we're going to want because we want this campaign to go forward. We know how to play those games that's just for a campaign. Imagine you have $1 billion product that you want. You know how to put the best foot forward because you want the best results. I'm not saying they're manipulating it, but I'm saying you know how to play the game to stack it at least in your favor.
Absolutely. Kim, I could talk to you forever, but I want to stop with one last question. What are or maybe two last questions, maybe. What are the next steps for you?
Well, for me, I think I will continue to do these conversations because I think we all have a role in it, right? And I think I love having conversations like this. I think those are super important. So that's one thing. For me personally, I am in the process of writing my book because I also feel like I've lived with the story for so long, but it's getting it out. But more importantly, I feel like this conversation has to happen in the real world the ground up approach and educating people, because I don't know, I've been in the system, I've seen the system. I don't know that changes, I mean, sure, there could be some micro changes, but I think the real change is going to be for people challenging the system. And so I think I will want to speak to everyday audiences. And I'm also trying to get more and more into the med schools, because I think, and I do have a couple that I do, where I present the students with my spider web and just kind of how I think I can say things that maybe a professor can't, because I can be the accidental advocate. But I also think when students have seen the documents that have come out from under seal that show some of the attitudes or behaviors of the drug companies to do with everyday products that they probably take with some of the antidepressants, I think they are like, I mean, their minds are blown, and they are like, why aren't they criminally charged?
Mm.
Because it's criminal. And I'm like, so I go, this is what I always say to them. You guys are in the role now that we trust when you become a doctor. We trust. So I hope this leaves you with this idea of just being critically thinking about remember that spider web. Think about, where are you being trapped? Because without you knowing, and you're blindly just trusting and following the system, it could potentially hurt and harm somebody, which is not why you go into medicine. So anyways, I love doing that too. So that's what I'm doing now.
Very, very, very interesting work. Very, very nice work. And I wish you all the best for the book. Once the book is out, maybe we should have a conversation again. It
Yes.
will be so enriching to read experiences and see how you've gone through, and what you've made out of it is also something phenomenally great.
Thanks. Yeah, I would love to. And I also have to say, I love talking to marketing people. And so I really appreciated this conversation, because you've worked on the inside, you've seen it, you understand, and you are doing great work in hosting these conversations. And I
Thank you.
think it's about conversations.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.